To a Deadly Silence. I'm your host, Larry Curtis, and it is the hope of all of us affiliated with this program to bring you current and educational information associated with the drug and alcohol addiction sweeping across the South Shore communities. Today, our guest is Susan Silva. Susan is a mother of 4 living in East Bridgewater, whose story appeared on the front page of the Enterprise on Monday, October 3rd, 2011, as part of the Enterprise's continuing Wasted Youth Deadly Surge series. Susan recently presented a forum called Don't Be Blindsided at the Mitchell Middle School in East Bridgewater, sponsored by the Bridgewater Savings Bank in partnership with East Bridgewater Public Schools and the East Bridgewater Police Department. Susan, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to be here. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and how you became involved with the forum, Don't Be Blindsided?
Well, as you said, I'm a mother of 4, married, have raised 3 adult children in what I felt was a very loving and pleasant upbringing, I guess you could say. But what brought me to the forum was the fact that I had a son who ended up turning to drugs. And the stigma and the hardness that brings to a family is pretty devastating. So I'm not the type of person who can just sit back and do anything, do nothing. And I couldn't fix my son. I could not fix what was happening to him. But I felt that I had something to give. I felt that maybe by telling my story, I could do something for other people, bring an awareness, bring education, and maybe help start erasing that stigma for families and even for addicts.
Let's talk about some of those little stigmas associated when all of a sudden you find out that a member of your family, in this case your son, even a loved one, whether it be relatives or somewhere, what are those type of feelings? I mean, I have experienced some of those feelings myself, the feeling of guilt, anger, frustration. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Well, one of the things that I believe is part of this stigma is feeling shunned by your peers, your family, your neighborhood. For me, that was really hard. I've never had that happen before. And that in turn made me feel lonely, angry. Didn't understand how people could do that to another person. One minute you're friends, and the next minute that friendship is cut off.
And that came about basically the son is identified as being a drug user, may have been involved
Correct.
in some criminal activity of some sort, and then all of a sudden, bang, you're shunned.
So always had a good amount of social connections, and within the community that I was living in, that happened. And I could tell, inside of me, I was like, if this is happening to me, how many other people are getting this? And is that why they're not stepping forward? Is that why they're not reaching out and getting help? Is that why they're staying isolated in this? Because if people know, this is what's going to happen to them.
Right. And there's almost, I always classified it as a feeling of suffering in silence,
Yeah.
that you could not really share your personal feelings and thoughts and where do you go for help?
Yeah.
Out there, so you are suffering internally, not only with the addict going through the issues associated with the addiction, but almost the family became a prisoner of the addict,
Pretty much.
From some perspective there. Tell me a little bit about the program, Don't Be Blindsided. How did that come about?
Well, it came about by writing a letter to the police chief and to some of the other community leaders, just letting them know my story. I backed up the letter with articles from the Enterprise, things that have been happening in the community for the last 2 years, from drug dealer busts to overdoses, etc. And just let the chief know that I would be willing to be a voice in the community. And within a week and a half of my mailing those letters off, he called me and said, we need to sit down and talk about this. And the Friday of April vacation, we sat down across his conference table and we talked, and he had said, the town had just started talking about the fact that they needed something. They didn't know what that something was, but they knew they needed something. And he asked me if I would be willing to be part of this, and I said absolutely, and we started meeting probably every 3 weeks, and we hashed out what this would look like. We invited more people to the table. The superintendent of schools got involved, which I was thrilled with, because a lot of communities, the schools, not my school.
There's denial. There's denial in the aspects that
And-
any drug activity would exist in their school.
Well,
Right, yeah.
and I would say that Superintendent Cody was not like that, but she really wanted to protect her kids, and I totally respected that.
As a good superintendent should.
Right, but she came across as someone who, she was going to help us with whatever resources the school could afford us, whether it was the use of the school, printing materials, et cetera. She was a huge help, and then we brought on Hilary Dubois from the Brockton Mayor's Opiate Coalition, and she was with us right from-
Fascinating young woman,
I
and
love her.
dynamic
She has
educator.
a wealth of knowledge and education and passion to really see people helped. And it grew from there, and we had a number of great speakers, and it was a great night, actually. We had probably about 170 to 200 people out, most of which were parents. I was really thrilled to see that it was mostly parents that came out. We did have some of the educators out. Each of the principals were there, a few of the teachers were there, but it was mostly parents that came out.
So really kind of a grassroots community effort that at some point the community recognized that this addiction issue is impacting what's happening in their community.
Absolutely.
And, you basically got together and bonded and said, we really need to take this on and make it. And that's fantastic to see that happening. I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think it's part of the reason that we're sitting here today is that there's a message that needs to be delivered that, this addiction issue, whether it's alcohol or drugs, is a epidemic that is affecting all of our lives in our community out there, and I commend you for obviously stepping forward on that way.
Well, thank you.
Let's play a little Monday Night Quarterback. Your son, as I read in the paper, 24 years old, currently a recovering addict, and that's count your blessings and say
Amen.
your prayers
Today's a
each
good
night.
day.
Today's a good day, exactly. How did he become involved in the drugs from your perspective, and what was his drug of choice?
How he became involved? Well, around the age of 15, he experimented with drugs, and it went badly. He did overdose, actually, on Klonopins and alcohol. I don't remember what the alcohol was, but he had a ride in an ambulance at that early age.
So a combination of pills and alcohol
Yeah.
consumption together at he was basically early high school.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
about 15 years old. Went badly, and matter of fact, a paramedic had to, the ambulance had to get pulled over. Paramedic had to come on board and give him a shot of something. I don't remember what it was at the time, just to keep him going till we get to the hospital. And I'll tell you, my first taste of this was I was not pleased with how the hospital handled it. We were told if he could stand and urinate, he could go home. There was no offer of a detox or counseling or helps of any kind. I was kind of blown away by that. We took matters in our own hands, and shortly thereafter we sent him away to a camp out in Colorado. It was an outward bound type camp. He was there for 7 weeks, came back from that, seemingly a changed young man, continued his late teenage years, got jobs, worked really well. And
Kind of that family values thing back on the right track that you mentioned early on.
Right, right. And we knew we had to do
Right.
something. I mean,
Right.
certainly something like that happens, you cannot ignore it. And I knew that we needed to do something, and the hospital offered nothing.
Okay.
So I heard about this camp, and off he went and was gone for 7
Was
weeks.
he resistant to going? I mean,
He thought it was going to be great.
Oh.
Outward bound, 72-mile hike in the San Juan Mountains.
Getting away from home for the summer or whatever it might have been.
Yeah, it was the whole
you know,
summer. He was gone basically for the whole summer.
A little vacation away from mom and dad and the other siblings there.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, he came back a changed man at that point.
Okay. Now, you mentioned in the article in the Enterprise back last Monday that you felt that there was a turning point as to what may have triggered his addiction, and it had to do with a surgery. Can you
Right.
share anything with that about?
He was working as a laborer for an HVAC company and was using an impact drill, and the impact drill kicked back, ended up shattering the scaphoid in his wrist, which from the orthopedics information that he gave us, it's the worst bone in your wrist that you can break. It required 2 surgeries. The first one was just to stabilize the wrist, and then about 3 or 4 months after that, they took a piece of bone from his hip and went in and repaired it permanently. And by the second surgery, he was pretty much addicted to OxyContin.
So had it be during the course of the rehabilitation in between surgeries, he was basically administered painkillers at that point in time?
He was sent home with painkillers. He was sent home with painkillers after the first surgery, and I knew nothing about what OxyContin was or how dangerous it could be or how addictive it was. And
as most of us in our communities knew
Did
virtually
not.
nothing 5 years ago when
Correct.
it became, the
Correct.
scourge
Right.
that it is today.
And 3 months later, we go in for the next surgery, and I had said to the doctor at the time, I said, he had a real hard time not using that medicine. Is there something else that he can take after this second surgery that maybe won't have such an effect on him? And at that time, he was 18, almost 19, and the doctor basically said, well, he's an adult, and that's between him and I. So after the second surgery, he again went home with OxyContin. And what I found out later, as my son has told me, that every time he went back to the doctor to revisit, to have the wrist looked at again, another OxyContin prescription was written and given to him. So in a matter of 6 months,
He had formed the addiction to, the painkillers. And even as his mother, he was 18 years of age, legal age status. You really had
I had no rights.
No rights,
Yeah. Thanks to
as to
HIPAA.
the care that was being administered to him. It's interesting because I had a personal experience in the emergency room at one time where my wife had an injury and the doctor was prescribing OxyContin, and knowing what we know today, the answer was no.
Yeah.
It's not that painful. No, you really should take this home with you. No. The third time the push came, and I sat there, looked at the doctor, and says, "Are you for real? What letter in no don't you understand? The end of the O."
Exactly.
It was really troubling, given the circumstances that we are now facing, with children who are recovering addicts from this type of a situation. You mentioned household signs that you began to notice that led you to believe that Mike was involved in drugs. What were some of those signs that, as this was happening?
Well, things started going missing. Things that couldn't be explained other than someone within the household was stealing. You come home from work and the house is locked, but the Xbox is missing, or a piece of jewelry was missing, or money was missing that was put away somewhere. So that was one of the first signs. But my mother in me did not want to believe that it was drugs. At the time, he was laid off. So
let alone that it might have been drug induced, but let alone that your own child might have been
stealing from you,
taken from the
Absolutely.
family, right?
And my thought was, well, maybe it's because he's unemployed right now. He wants and needs money, and this was his way of doing that. Anything in your head to protect that mother's heart from thinking my child is using drugs.
And if confronted with the question, are you aware of, do you know what happened to the Xbox, or did you notice?
Always denial.
Always total denial.
Total, absolute denial. Someone must have broken the house, etc. And, there was a pattern of that, and then that led up to our finding the syringes in his room. And there was no denying it after that.
You mentioned that in the article, as well as that in the course of rearranging his room at some point in time, you and your husband were moving the furniture around, you moved the mattress, and out comes the syringes.
2 syringes between the mattress and the box spring.
So at that point in time, you realized that this wasn't just a pill addiction. This was a much more serious, heroin addiction. And of course, at that same time, I believe the Enterprise was beginning its series on, A Wasted Youth, about the whole epidemic of the opiates and heroin addiction around the South.
And I had no clue that OxyContin would move to a heroin addiction. I didn't know anything about heroin. Never mind that, they're the same basic compound, and that addicts today are going to the cheaper heroin rather quickly because they can't afford OxyContin or oxycodone or the Perk 30s. And I had no clue that that's the path that takes place.
let alone the effect that it has on the addict and the craving
Oh my
that
goodness,
just
yeah.
can't
Yeah.
be released from, you
Yeah.
know, from them as well.
All the agitation and the violent outbursts, et cetera. And here we were taking him to doctors, taking him to a psychiatrist. You know, what's wrong with him? We're told, oh, bipolar disorder with schizophrenia, you know, and then he's put on these other medications
Attention
that
deficit
just,
syndrome seems
oh
to
my
be
goodness,
the
yeah.
you know, the receptacle for all disorders today.
And then he's
You
put
know,
on,
yeah.
you know, other medication for mood disorders, and you add to that the Oxycontin and the heroin, and he was an absolute mess. He was an absolute mess. And I'm looking at these prescribed drugs from the psychiatrist thinking, okay, well, this is why he's tired. This is why he's this. This is why he's lethargic. Well, when the truth is, he wasn't even taking those. He was barely taking those, but was really using heroin.
What about, you know, you talked to needles under the mattress. What about other places within the house that drugs can be potentially hidden? What did you begin thinking? What were you finding?
I started going through everything. I mean, we tore his whole bedroom apart, his closet apart. If there was a shoebox in his room, it got totally emptied out. And we just went through everything. We went through both bathrooms to find, you know, to make sure there wasn't anything in any of the bathrooms, because he would spend a lot of time in the bathroom. So we emptied out all the cupboards, all the underneath the cabinets, everywhere. But what we found was the basement and the garage were two places where we found the bent and burnt spoons and that type of paraphernalia. So it can be...
So your spoons were going missing.
My spoons, I had nothing left for spoons, nothing.
And if there's one sign that's evident right out there, that's one of them. You know, all of a sudden you might have a place setting of 12 or 15 spoons in there,
And now you
then
have nothing.
now you're down to 6.
You know, and we're going, did we take them to work? Did we not bring them home? You know, because we always take our lunch to work. Oh my goodness, what did we do with them? And you don't think, no, someone's using them to cook heroin.